He sat on the same bench every day, until a teenager finally asked why. He was there so often that people stopped noticing him altogether. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe if you love meaningful stories, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I really enjoy seeing where these stories travel. Every morning, just before 9, he walked the same path along the edge of the park, coffee in one hand, the other tucked into the pocket of a worn navy coat. He didn't glance at the sky or the trees or the joggers passing with earbuds in. He just walked, steady and quiet, until he reached the same bench, second from the fountain, right beneath the tall oak with the low-hanging limb. He sat down like it was a sign to him. Didn't stretch, didn't sigh, just lowered himself slowly, set his cup beside him, and folded his hands on his lap. He didn't pull out a book, didn't check a phone, just sat, still, watching nothing in particular. People passed him all the time. Mothers pushing strollers, a man who walked his dog twice a day without fail, teenagers cutting through the park on their way to the bus stop, runners, tourists, one kid on a skateboard who swerved around the bench every time like it was part of an obstacle course. Everyone saw him. No one said anything. Not at first. Some thought he might be waiting for someone. Others assumed he just liked the park. A few figured maybe he had nowhere else to go. But no one asked. The bench was always his, rain or shine, wind or fog, on days when the sun warmed the wood and days when the cold made it feel like stone. He didn't miss a single morning. He wasn't homeless. That much people figured out quickly. His clothes were clean. His shoes, though worn, were laced neatly. His face shaved. His coffee fresh. Always the same travel mug, silver with a black lid. He carried himself like someone who used to be busy and now had nowhere else he needed to be. Some kids made jokes about him, gave him a nickname, called him the Statue. The name didn't stick, because he wasn't odd, or angry, or lost. He just seemed steady, like part of the park. One teenager noticed him more than the rest. His name was Caleb. 15, usually in a hurry, always late for the bus. But he passed the bench almost every morning, and the man was always there, sitting like time didn't apply to him. Caleb didn't think much of it at first, until the 4th week in a row when he saw the man sitting through the drizzle with nothing over his head, hands clasped, coat damp, same coffee at his side, and still calm. The next day, Caleb slowed as he passed. The day after that, he stopped for 3 seconds, then kept walking. It took a month before he said anything. Not because he was scared, just because he didn't want to be the kid who ruined something quiet. But eventually, curiosity won. One morning, with his backpack slung over one shoulder and a granola bar in his hand, Caleb stopped at the bench. The man looked up, not startled, not annoyed, just aware. Caleb nodded once, awkward. "You always sit here?" The man smiled a little. "Most days." Caleb shifted his weight. "Why?" The man didn't answer right away. He looked out at the fountain, at the path curving past the trees, then said 4 words. "Because she liked it." Caleb blinked. "Who?" The man just looked down at his coffee. Caleb waited, got nothing more, so he nodded once, mumbled "okay," and walked off toward the bus stop. But the question stayed with him. And the next day, he stopped again. Caleb didn't plan on stopping again, but the next morning he found himself walking slower as he neared the bench. The man was already there, same spot, same posture. Coffee resting near his right knee, steam curling into the cool air. His coat looked a little heavier than the day before, collar flipped up against the wind. He didn't look over as Caleb approached. He just stared ahead, like always, eyes fixed on nothing in particular. Caleb hesitated for a second, then sat down. Not close, just on the other end of the bench. The man turned slightly, nodded once. "Morning," he said. Caleb nodded back. "Hey." They sat in silence. It wasn't awkward. Not exactly. But it wasn't comfortable either. Caleb pulled his hoodie tighter, watched a squirrel dart across the path and disappear behind a tree. A jogger passed, music playing faintly from one earbud. After a minute, Caleb spoke. "You said yesterday, because she liked it." The man didn't look over. He just nodded slowly. Caleb waited. Nothing more came. So he tried again. "Who was she?" The man finally turned his head, eyes soft but steady. "My wife," he said. "Elaine." Caleb didn't respond right away. He hadn't expected the answer to come so quickly, or so quietly. "She used to sit here?" "Every morning," the man said. 8:40, without fail. Caleb looked at his watch. It was 8:41. "You're on her schedule." The man nodded. "Habit's hard to break." Caleb leaned back against the bench, looked around the park like he might spot some version of her still sitting there. He imagined an older woman with a book, a travel mug of her own. Maybe she had a certain way of sitting. Maybe she liked watching the dogs go by. He didn't ask anything else. The man didn't offer more. They just sat. After a few minutes, Caleb stood up. "Well, see you tomorrow, maybe." The man nodded. Maybe. The next day, Caleb came 5 minutes early. The man was already there. This time, Caleb didn't wait. He sat on the same side of the bench, just a little closer. Not enough to crowd, just enough to feel like he meant to be there. The man gave a small smile. Caleb asked another question. "What did she like about this bench?" The man didn't hesitate. "The light. This side catches it just right." Caleb looked up. He hadn't noticed it before, but the sunlight did fall differently here. The trees filtered it so it hit the bench in thin stripes. Warm, soft, like a spotlight, but quieter. "She used to say this was the only place the sun showed up on time," he added. Caleb chuckled. "That's kind of funny." "She was." They didn't talk much after that. Just sat until the minute hand on Caleb's watch told him he was pushing his luck with the bus. He stood up again. "I'll be late," he said. The man gave a knowing look. "Then you'll remember something." Caleb paused. "Like what?" The man looked out at the path again. "That you stopped. That you asked." Caleb didn't say anything else. He just walked off, slower this time. He didn't know why he kept showing up. He wasn't trying to be polite, wasn't trying to make it a habit. But something about that bench, and the way the man sat like the world still had something left to show him, made Caleb want to come back. The stories didn't come all at once. They arrived in pieces, quiet and slow. The next week, Caleb kept showing up. Not every day, but enough that it felt like a pattern. Some mornings he brought a granola bar, once a pack of apple slices he didn't finish. He always sat on the same side of the bench now. The man still showed up first, always at 8:40, always with the same silver coffee mug, always with the kind of patience that looked like he had nowhere else to be. They didn't talk every day. Sometimes they just sat, watched the same people go by, the same jogger with neon shoes, the same man with 2 dachshunds who barked at everything that moved, the same woman with a stroller and a little girl who wore sparkly boots even when it wasn't raining. But every now and then, the man would say something. Not prompted, not planned. Just a sentence or two that settled into the air like it had been waiting. "She used to tuck her feet up when she sat," he said once. "Crossed them like a pretzel. Thought it made the bench more comfortable." Caleb looked at him. "Did it?" "She said it did." Another time he pointed at the pigeons gathered near the fountain. She hated those things, called them sidewalk thieves. Caleb grinned. Why? They stole her sandwich once. Never let it go. They laughed quietly, then sat in the quiet again. Caleb started to notice things he hadn't before. The way the man tapped his thumb against the side of his mug every few minutes. The way he watched the trees, not like someone killing time, but like someone remembering something important. He never brought a phone, never checked his watch. When the time came, he simply stood up and walked away. One morning, Caleb got there early, earlier than usual. The man was already on the bench, holding something in his lap. A book. Small, hardcover, the kind with the jacket worn soft at the edges. She used to read this one here, the man said without being asked. 1 chapter a day. Caleb nodded slowly. You read it now? Sometimes. Out loud. Sometimes just in my head. He handed it over. Caleb looked at the title. Something about gardens and quiet mornings. Not a book he would have picked up on his own. She read it cover to cover 3 times, the man said. Always found something new. Caleb handed it back carefully. Was this your bench too, or just hers? The man smiled gently. It was hers first. I just followed. They sat like that for a while. 2 people. Same seat. Different reasons. Caleb thought about asking what happened to her. He figured he already knew, but still, it felt like a question that didn't need to be spoken yet. Maybe ever. The man never looked sad. Not exactly. Just like someone who remembered more than he said out loud. The next morning, Caleb brought his own coffee. It was too hot, too bitter, but he held it anyway. He didn't say anything when he sat down. Neither did the man. But when the wind picked up, and a few leaves scattered across the sidewalk, the man said one more thing. She said the wind always told better stories than the people. Caleb looked at the trees, the sky, the way the light hit the bench. Maybe she was right, he said. The man smiled, just barely. She usually was. It became a habit. Caleb showing up, the man already there. The bench had become something steady, even if Caleb wasn't sure exactly what for. He didn't talk much at school about the mornings he spent at the park, not because he didn't want to, but because the man hadn't asked him to. It felt like something separate from everything else in his life. Quiet, but solid. Something that wasn't supposed to be explained. He'd been coming for over a month when the man said something that made Caleb stop and listen. One morning, the bench was particularly empty. A breeze stirred the leaves, and the sky looked like it might rain. Caleb was a little late, but when he walked up to the park, he saw the man sitting there, his coffee mug held loosely in one hand. His eyes weren't on the usual things, the joggers, the dogs, the kids playing near the swings. His focus was somewhere far off, deeper than what was in front of him. You know, she never liked rain, the man said, as Caleb sat down. Caleb shifted. Who? Your wife? The man nodded. Elaine. She hated it. Would get grumpy if it rained during the week. She'd say, it's like the world's just waiting for me to feel sorry for myself. Caleb glanced up at the gray sky, then back at the man. Did it ever stop her from sitting here? No. She didn't like the rain, but she liked the bench. He smiled faintly. The rain didn't matter when you were already where you wanted to be. Caleb thought about that for a minute. He wasn't sure what he was supposed to say. He wasn't good at this part, the part where you listen, but don't really know what you're hearing yet. Did she come here every day? Most days. She liked to sit and just listen, or read sometimes, always right here. The man pointed to the spot beside him. She liked it when the trees were full, The leaves made a sound like a song. Caleb nodded. He wasn't sure if the story was about the bench or about something else. The man never spoke of her with sadness in his voice, just a quiet acknowledgement that she was gone. The silence that came after felt different than the other mornings. Not empty, just deep. Caleb shifted on the bench, wondering if he should ask more or just let it sit. "Do you come here every day because of her?" Caleb asked. The man didn't look at him. He took a slow sip of his coffee. "I come because this was our place. It's what's left of it." Caleb couldn't figure out how to reply to that. The words didn't feel enough. Instead, he sat and watched the rain start to fall, soft and steady, over the park. He noticed how the droplets clung to the leaves, how the world seemed to slow down for a moment. A few minutes later, the man shifted on the bench and stood up slowly. "You can stay," he said. "I'll be back tomorrow." Caleb watched him walk toward the path that led out of the park. He didn't know why the man had said that. Maybe it was just the usual goodbye, or maybe it was something else. Something that made Caleb feel like there was more he could learn. The bench was empty for a minute, just as it had always been when no one else sat there. Caleb stayed. He wasn't sure why, but something about that quiet morning, that small story about rain, made him think about the people who were still around him, and the people who weren't. When he finally stood up to leave, the rain had stopped, and the park felt a little quieter. Maybe that was the point, to notice the things you couldn't see before. He wasn't in any rush to leave the park. The bench was still there, waiting, still empty. And somehow, that didn't feel so bad. It wasn't the same without the man sitting beside him, but Caleb kept coming back. The weather had started to change. The mornings were colder now, and the park felt emptier, quieter. The leaves were almost gone, replaced by patches of bare branches that stretched like thin fingers across the sky. He'd gotten used to seeing the man every day, and now that he wasn't there, it felt different. Caleb sat alone on the bench one Tuesday morning, wrapping his hands around a cup of coffee, trying to keep it warm in the brisk air. He hadn't seen the man for a week, not since the last time they'd spoken. The man had stood up, said, "I'll be back tomorrow," and walked away. He hadn't come back. There were a few other people in the park, joggers moving quickly past the fountain, a mother pushing a stroller, a dog that pulled at its leash. But it all felt distant. Caleb couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. The man, the quiet stories, the simple presence, it all seemed like something he'd taken for granted. After half an hour, Caleb stood up and walked the path the man always used to take. He didn't know why, but he felt like he needed to ask, to make sure everything was okay. The path curved around the small pond, past the row of benches near the entrance, and eventually to the small gate that led out of the park. Caleb walked it slowly, looking around as if he might find the man sitting on a bench somewhere, sipping his coffee, watching the world pass by. He didn't find him. The park was mostly empty, and the air smelled faintly of wet leaves and damp wood. Caleb stood at the edge of the pond for a moment, staring at the water that was still and dark. Then a voice behind him. "You're up early." Caleb turned around, startled. The man stood a few paces away, dressed in his usual coat, the same silver coffee mug in his hand. Caleb smiled, unsure whether to be relieved or confused. "You came back." The man gave a slow nod. "Had to." Caleb stepped toward him. "Where'd you go?" The man shrugged. "Some things you can't plan." He didn't explain further, and Caleb didn't ask. He stood there for a moment, wondering if there was more the man wanted to say, but he didn't seem in any hurry to fill the silence. Instead, he just looked at the park, at the trees now bare, the path winding off into the distance. "I thought you weren't coming back," Caleb said finally. The man gave a small, dry laugh. "I didn't say goodbye." Caleb looked at him. "I guess you didn't." They stood together for a moment before Caleb said, "It's just not the same without you on the bench." The man nodded. "I know." There was a long pause before Caleb added, "Why do you keep coming here?" The man took a slow sip from his mug and glanced around at the empty benches. "Because I don't want it to be empty." That answer seemed simple enough, but something in the way he said it made Caleb want to stay quiet. He didn't press for more. Instead, he sat down on the bench, and after a moment, the man sat beside him, settling into the same spot where he always did. Neither of them said anything for a while. They didn't need to. It was cold that morning, colder than it had been before, but the silence between them didn't feel cold. It felt comfortable, like the bench itself had somehow made a place for both of them to exist in it. Eventually, the man spoke again. "She would have liked the quiet." Caleb turned to look at him. "Who?" The man's eyes softened. "Elaine, my wife. She liked it when everything slowed down." For a moment, Caleb wasn't sure what to say. The weight of the words hung there, even though they hadn't been said aloud in a long time. He didn't say much, just nodded. They stayed until the sun began to rise higher, and the park slowly came to life with more people. The man stood up, a little slower than before, but steady, and Caleb followed. "I'll see you tomorrow?" Caleb asked. The man didn't answer right away, but after a moment he smiled. "Yeah, same bench." Caleb watched him walk away, then turned back to the bench. It was still empty, but now it didn't feel so quiet. Caleb kept coming back to the bench, but the mornings started to feel different. It wasn't just the weather anymore. It wasn't even just the man's absence. The park felt emptier, like the space between the trees had grown wider, the path a little lonelier. Maybe it was because he'd gotten used to the man's quiet company, his stories, the way they never needed words to fill the time. But the bench was still there, and Caleb found himself sitting on it each morning, even when he didn't know exactly why. He didn't see the man again for 2 weeks. The park stayed the same: runners, dog walkers, the occasional family on a Sunday outing. But Caleb began to wonder if maybe the man had moved on. Maybe it had been a one-time thing. He didn't know if he should feel disappointed or relieved. One morning, as Caleb sat on the bench, his eyes wandered over the park. He saw people coming and going, caught glimpses of conversations happening on nearby benches. For the first time, he noticed how much of it he'd missed. The way the joggers' feet barely made a sound on the gravel, how the pigeons clustered around the fountain, how even the trees seemed to have their own stories to tell. And then, just like that, he heard footsteps behind him. He didn't need to turn around. He knew. The man was back. Caleb didn't say anything at first. He just watched the path, pretending not to notice, until the man sat down beside him on the bench. "You came back," Caleb said after a moment, a little surprised at how relieved he felt. The man looked at him, and for a second, Caleb saw something in his eyes, something that felt like the kind of understanding you get after a long time of knowing someone, even if you've only spoken a few words. "I always come back," the man said quietly. Caleb wasn't sure what to say to that. He hadn't expected the man to explain himself, but it didn't stop the question from floating in his head. Why did he keep coming back? "What kept you away?" Caleb asked. The man shifted a little on the bench, taking a breath as if he had to gather his thoughts. "Sometimes," he said slowly, "you need time to remember. You need time to see if the quiet still works." Caleb looked at him, not quite understanding but sensing there was something more to the answer than just the words. "I get that," Caleb said finally. "Sometimes the quiet is the hardest part." The man nodded, almost like he was agreeing with Caleb without needing to explain further. They sat like that for a while, Caleb with his hands tucked into his hoodie pockets, the man sipping from his mug. After a while, Caleb broke the silence. "You used to come here every day with her, didn't you?" The man glanced over at him, eyes softening. "Yeah," he said quietly. "Every day. She liked the mornings here." Caleb shifted on the bench. "What made her choose this spot?" The man smiled a little, his eyes far away, like he was reaching for a memory that hadn't been touched in a while. "She liked the view," he said. "The way the light hit the bench in the mornings, the way everything felt still. She said this was where the world took a breath before it started moving again." Caleb looked around at the park, the early morning light coming through the trees. He hadn't thought about it that way before. "Sounds like she knew how to appreciate things," Caleb said. The man gave a small chuckle. "She did. Better than most." They both sat quietly for a while, letting the conversation settle. Caleb didn't feel like he needed to ask anything else. He didn't need to fill the space with words anymore. The man stood up after a while, stretching his legs and offering Caleb a quiet smile. "Same time tomorrow?" Caleb asked. The man nodded. "Same time." As he walked away, Caleb stayed on the bench, feeling something shift in him. The space wasn't as empty as it had been before. The man had come back, but something else had changed too. The understanding between them, unspoken, but there nonetheless. And for the first time in a long while, Caleb realized that maybe the quiet was what they'd both been waiting for. Not to fill the space, but to let it be. Let it sit, undisturbed. Let it breathe. The mornings had become a rhythm. Caleb would show up a few minutes before 8:30. The man would be sitting on the bench with his coffee in hand, and they'd share the silence until the world around them began to wake up. More joggers, more walkers, the occasional school bus rumbling by, the same park, the same bench, but it never felt predictable. It felt like they were starting something. That particular Tuesday, the air was colder than usual, and the wind carried a little more bite to it. Caleb showed up just as the first light of day broke through the trees, but the man was already there. He sat with his coat pulled tightly around him, his hands wrapped around the coffee mug like it was the only warmth in the world. The bench wasn't as empty anymore. It never had been, really. Not since the day Caleb first asked the question that had started everything. The man's presence had become something Caleb could count on. But that morning, as Caleb sat down, something felt different. There was a stillness in the air, not just from the quiet of the park, but from the man himself. He was less focused on the movement of the world around them and more inward. "Everything okay?" Caleb asked, glancing at him as he settled onto the bench. The man didn't answer right away. His eyes were on the ground, his brow furrowed in thought. After a moment, he set the coffee mug down on the bench beside him, then spoke, not looking at Caleb. "I've been thinking," he started, his voice quieter than usual, "about the bench, about how long it's been here." Caleb glanced down at the worn wood. The bench hadn't changed since the first day he'd sat on it, but there was something about it now that felt more important, more familiar. "Longer than I've been around," the man continued. "It's always been part of the park, part of everything. People sit here for a while, then leave. Some never come back. Some come for years." Caleb was quiet for a moment, watching the wind push a few leaves across the path. "You've been coming here for a long time." The man nodded slowly. "Too long to count." There was something in his voice, a weight that made Caleb sit up a little straighter. "You ever think about moving on?" Caleb asked, his words almost a whisper. The man didn't respond at first. He just picked up his mug again, taking a slow sip. Then, after a long pause, he set it down and finally turned to look at Caleb. His eyes were steady, not sad, but not as distant as they usually were either. "I think about it all the time," he said, his voice low. "I think about what it would be like to leave, to not come back here anymore. But every time I start to walk away, something keeps me here." Caleb nodded, not sure what to say. He understood, but he didn't. Not completely. He didn't know what it was like to have a place, a memory that tied him down, not like the man did. "I guess I just get used to it," the man added after a moment. "This bench, the park, the quiet. It becomes part of you, whether you want it to or not." The words hung between them for a long time. Caleb didn't push. He didn't ask for more. It wasn't like before, when they had just shared space. This was something else. This was the man telling Caleb something real, something deeper than what he'd ever said before. And for the first time, Caleb understood. Some things don't change, not because they're stuck, but because they're meant to stay. The wind picked up again, scattering a few more leaves. It was colder now, but it didn't feel uncomfortable. Caleb looked at the man, then back at the park. Everything felt still, like it had always been this way. "You know," Caleb said slowly, "I think you're supposed to be here." The man looked at him, a small smile appearing at the edge of his lips. "I think so too." They both sat in silence after that, watching the world move around them. Neither of them rushed to fill the space with words. Neither of them needed to. The park was quiet. The trees were bare. The bench still stood, as it always had, waiting. And somehow, it felt like the right place to be. It was the first time Caleb noticed how much the man had changed. It wasn't obvious, not at first. It wasn't something anyone could pinpoint, really. It was in the way the man sat a little straighter, in the way his eyes were focused, not on the park, but on something further, deeper, like he wasn't just passing time anymore. That Tuesday morning was colder than usual, and the park was quieter, the air a little heavier. Caleb arrived at the bench a few minutes early, hands tucked into his jacket pockets. When he saw the man, he noticed that his usual posture had shifted. He wasn't just sitting anymore. He was waiting. For what? Caleb didn't know. But there was something different in the way the man held himself, something that made Caleb stop and take a breath. "Good morning," Caleb said as he sat down beside him. The man glanced over, his eyes more alert than they'd been in a while. "Morning," he replied. His voice had a little more life in it than usual, a little more energy. Caleb hesitated, not sure how to ask the question that had been on his mind since he'd first seen the change. "Are you okay?" The man took a slow sip from his coffee, then set the mug down on the bench beside him. He looked at Caleb, his face still calm, but there was something in his expression that Caleb hadn't seen before. Something almost like a release. "I'm better than okay," the man said, his voice steady but with a hint of something that Caleb couldn't quite place. "I've been thinking about what you said a while back, about how I keep coming back here." Caleb didn't remember exactly what he'd said. Probably just a question about the man's routine, about why he kept sitting there every day, year after year. The man continued, still looking at him, but now with a depth that felt different. "You asked me once if I ever thought about moving on, leaving the bench. I didn't have an answer then, but I think I have one now." Caleb didn't speak. He wasn't sure he should. He just waited, letting the quiet stretch between them. "I've been here a long time, Caleb," the man said, his eyes focusing on the bench now. "A long time. But it's not just about the bench. It's about the habit of sitting, the waiting. And somewhere along the way, I stopped needing to wait for anything." The words hung in the air, and Caleb felt something shift inside him. The man wasn't just talking about the bench anymore. He wasn't just talking about a place. He was talking about something more, something Caleb wasn't sure how to define, but he felt it in the space between them. "I think I've been waiting for something that's already here," the man continued. "And now that I've realized that, I can stop waiting." Caleb looked at him, the words coming to him slowly. "So you're not going to sit here anymore?" The man shook his head, smiling a little. "I'll sit here, but not because I'm waiting, just because I want to." Caleb sat back, absorbing the shift in the air. The park still looked the same. The leaves were still falling in thin, spiraling patterns. People still passed by in their own rhythm, too busy to stop, too focused on their own paths to notice anything different. But something had changed. The man wasn't sitting on the bench waiting anymore. He was sitting there because he wanted to. That was all. They sat together, side by side, in the same place, and for the first time, Caleb didn't feel the need to ask anything more. Sometimes it wasn't about what came next. Sometimes it was just about showing up, being there, and that was enough. After a while, Caleb stood up. "I think I'm going to head out." The man nodded. "Take care, Caleb." As Caleb walked away, he looked back once, but the man hadn't moved. He wasn't waiting anymore. He was just there. And that was the most peaceful thing Caleb had ever seen. The bench was still the same. The man was still the same. But everything had changed. Just enough. Caleb came to the bench the next day, but the man wasn't there. It wasn't the first time the man had missed a morning, but it felt different this time. The bench felt emptier than it had before. Not because of the absence, but because Caleb had started to expect something from it. Something from the man. A quiet conversation, the kind that didn't require a lot of words, but somehow filled the space. He sat down anyway, a little earlier than usual, trying not to feel disappointed. The park was still familiar. The same joggers, the same dogs, the same kids running by with backpacks. The world hadn't stopped moving, even though, for a moment, it felt like it should have. Caleb looked around, half expecting the man to show up any minute. But as the minutes passed, he realized that the park was just like it always was, only with him sitting there alone. And maybe, for the first time, that felt okay. An hour later, as he stood up to leave, he saw someone walking toward him, an older man with a small bag of groceries in one hand. Caleb didn't recognize him right away, but something in the way the man moved caught his attention. He walked slowly, deliberately, and stopped just short of the bench. "Is this seat taken?" the man asked, his voice quiet, like he was asking a question that didn't need an answer. Caleb blinked, a little thrown off by the question. "No," he said. "It's free." The man nodded and sat down, slowly lowering himself onto the bench. He didn't look at Caleb right away. Instead, he took a deep breath, exhaled, and looked out at the park, as if he had been here 1,000 times before and didn't need to say anything to prove it. For a few minutes, neither of them spoke. The quiet wasn't uncomfortable. It was familiar, like the way the man sat, like the park itself. There was something about it that made Caleb feel like he wasn't alone, even though the bench was only half occupied. Finally, the man turned to him and spoke. "You waiting for someone?" Caleb paused, not sure how to answer. I don't know. Not really. Just sitting here. The man nodded. Yeah, sometimes that's all you need to do. Caleb looked at him, surprised by the simplicity of the words, and a little confused. Do you come here often? He asked. The man glanced around, then back at Caleb. Every now and then, I don't really have a reason to. Just get out. Take a break. For some reason, that answer felt right. The idea that the park, the bench, didn't need to be anything grand to have meaning. It was just there. It just was. They both sat in silence for a while longer, watching the leaves drift past, the shadows shift with the sun. Caleb didn't feel rushed to leave. He didn't feel the need to fill the quiet with questions or answers. It just seemed like it was enough to be there. Just two people on the same bench, watching the world go by. Eventually, Caleb stood up, a little surprised at how much time had passed. He had to go. His bus would be coming soon, and he didn't want to miss it. Take care, the man said, just as Caleb started to walk away. You too, Caleb replied, pausing for a second. You come here a lot? The man smiled slightly, as if the question didn't need to be answered. Sometimes, he said. Sometimes, it's just enough to sit. Caleb nodded and walked away. But this time, something inside him felt lighter, more settled. The bench wasn't just a place to wait for something to happen. It was a place to stop, to let things slow down, even if just for a moment. And in that quiet, between the world moving and the world waiting, maybe that was all he needed to understand. The man stayed on the bench. Caleb didn't know if he would be there tomorrow, or the next day, or the day after that. But it didn't matter. Some things didn't need to be permanent to matter. And the bench, just like the park, just like the people who sat there, would always be waiting for the next story to begin. Thank you for watching. If you enjoy meaningful stories like this, we'd love to have you as a subscriber.